Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on using pre-assessments to accelerate learning. My name is Toni Martindale, and I'm a Curriculum Instruction and Equity Specialist with Lancaster Lebanon IU13. If at any point in your accelerated learning journey you have questions about pre-assessments, need support, or are looking for a thought partner, please don't hesitate to reach out via email at the email address on the screen, toni_martindale@iu13.org. This session is part of a series of webinars that Lancaster Lebanon IU13 is facilitating to provide responsive, high-quality, focused professional learning experiences that highlight practical and actionable strategies for accelerated learning. The topics and content within this virtual professional learning series were developed as a result of the feedback and supports requested by IU13 member districts, evolving research and data on pandemic recovery, Pennsylvania Department of Education guidance, and statewide PAIU network expertise. There are 4 components within the Pennsylvania Department of Education's Accelerated Learning Framework. The first is high-quality academics. The purpose of this component is to define the instructional changes needed to foster a culture of data-informed decision-making to ensure every learner has access to the instructional strategies, materials, and supports needed to successfully engage with and master grade-level content. The second is supportive learning environments. The purpose of this component is to ensure that we're providing a safe and inclusive space for learning, forming positive and supportive relationships, and supporting learners and staff to mentally and socially recover from the stress of the pandemic. Number 3 is healthy systems conditions. The healthy systems component focuses on engaging a diverse group of stakeholders within your education community to gain a deeper understanding of the school system and utilize the continuous improvement process and tools to address systemic needs, including staffing, technology, and scheduling that will create the conditions for accelerated learning. And finally, a system of scaffolded supports. This component provides a continuum of evidence-based academic, behavioral, social, and emotional supports aligned with students' needs. Today's webinar topic falls under the high-quality academics component of PDE's accelerated learning model. So to start us off, I think it's important that we unpack what accelerated learning is and how it is different from a traditional remediation approach. So in a traditional setting, the approach might be remediation, where access to rigorous grade level material is delayed until all gaps in learning are filled. So that means that we've always seen gaps in learning in our students from one grade level to the next. We know that the pandemic has exacerbated those gaps. And under the remediation framework, teachers would spend most of their time trying to reteach all of those components that learners may have missed in previous years in order to prepare them for future learning. The problem then becomes that those gaps become wider and wider, and there's really no way then to close those gaps. In an accelerated learning model, this is preparing students for new learning in combination with just-in-time teaching of missing key skills and concepts in the purposeful context of current lessons. So in the acceleration framework, teachers are exposing students to rigorous grade level content and preparing them to do so by assessing where the learners are, what prerequisite skills and knowledge students need to access that new material through ongoing assessments, and then providing them with opportunities to master that while exposing them to that important grade level content. This is important because research shows that when students have access to rigorous and complex grade level materials, they are more likely to be successful. This is a study that comes from the opportunity myth. And the quote says, when students who started the year behind grade level had access to stronger instruction, they closed gaps with their peers by 6 months, as opposed to students who are just remediated. They're never really given that chance then to fill in those gaps. So what is our learning goal for today? Our learning goal for today is to understand how, when used purposefully and intentionally, pre-assessments can be a powerful tool in accelerating learning for all learners. All of the materials and resources that are referenced throughout today's session can be found at the website linked below, and that is tinyurl.com/IU13AL pre-assessment. So let's start us off with a pre-assessment. And really, this is more like a self-assessment since this is a webinar format. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a Jamboard. Jamboard is a fantastic free resource that teachers can use to pre-assess and use other kinds of formative assessments throughout a unit to quickly and easily gauge where their learners are in the learning process. So rather than actually engaging in the Jamboard, I'm going to ask you just to think about where you are in relation to these statements, keeping in mind that this is really a continuum and this may vary depending on the unit or topic that you're teaching. So the first question is, I consistently and intentionally administer pre-assessments with my learners. So just take a moment to think about where you fall. Thumbs up, thumbs down, or somewhere in between. The next statement is, I intentionally use data from pre-assessments to identify gaps in learning, preview new content, and provide targeted supports and to group learners. So again, take a moment to think about how you use data from your pre-assessments in your instructional design. Okay, next, I believe pre-assessments can be a helpful tool in addressing unfinished learning/learning lag due to the pandemic. Again, think about where you may fall on that continuum. All right, so you can see in this pre-assessment, I'm really using it to activate some prior knowledge and to get you prepared and in that headspace to talk about pre-assessments. And this may be one way that you use pre-assessments in your own classroom with your own learners as a way to activate prior knowledge and get them prepared for the content that you're going to teach. This, you could see if we were to do this live, is also a really great way for me to gauge what are your attitudes and perceptions about pre-assessments and how are you currently using them. This would help me then make on-the-fly decisions about where to go with our session today. So let's talk about what a pre-assessment is. So just take a minute on your own to think about what is a pre-assessment, how would you define it, and how is a pre-assessment different from and similar to other kinds of formative assessments you may use in your classroom. Now, let's take a look at some examples of pre-assessments that you may have used with your learners. Take a moment to look over these images of some really well-known and popular kinds of pre-assessments. What do you notice? What do you wonder? What you'll probably notice is that we see a combination of both formal and informal kinds of pre-assessments. So a pre-assessment can be as simple as a thumbs up, thumbs down. It might be some affinity mapping with sticky notes where you have your kids do some brainstorming and then some categorizing to give them an idea of where they might be going in the unit and to give you an idea of what they already know. You might use a strategy like whiteboarding, or you could do something a little more formal like a written pretest, a Frayer model, a KWL chart, or even something like an observation checklist where you're observing what students are saying, how they're acting, the conversations that they're having with their learners and with you. So these are all forms of pre-assessments that you may use. And again, just keep in mind that the term synonymous, or the term assessment rather, is not synonymous with testing. A test is a kind of assessment, but all of these other kinds of activities that you see here, as well as myriad digital tools, things like Flipgrid or Jamboard or Padlet or Kahoot, those all make really wonderful digital pre-assessments as well. So I want to turn to this definition of pre-assessments, and this comes from Susan Brookhart. I'm going to give you a moment just to read over this. And she says that assessment that teachers use to determine students' knowledge, skills, attitudes, and dispositions before planning a unit or sequence of lessons is called pre-assessment to plan instruction. Pre-assessment is a kind of formative assessment, and it occurs before instruction, while other formative assessment strategies occur during instruction. So this seems pretty straightforward, but I want to highlight a couple of pieces of this definition that I think are really important. Let's look at the first part of this definition. A pre-assessment can measure knowledge, skills, attitudes, and dispositions. So teachers can design pre-assessments to measure any kind of learning goal. Perhaps a cognitive pre-assessment, or perhaps they want to measure a cognitive learning goal. A cognitive pre-assessment addresses academic goals and focus on what students know and can do. For instance, a teacher may ask a student what a student remembers from a previous lesson, or pose an initial question such as, why is it warm in summer and cold in the winter? I would argue that cognitive pre-assessments are the most common form used in classrooms today. I know in my mind, when I think about a pre-assessment, I tend to think about measuring what students know, what their knowledge base is. Teachers can use effective pre-assessments to tap into students' attitudes, beliefs, dispositions, or interests. And we saw a little bit of that in the prior pre-assessment that we did when I asked about your beliefs around pre-assessments. Teachers might ask students how confident they feel in learning new things, how much they like school, how much effort they put into their schoolwork, or if they view themselves as hardworking and conscientious. Finally, behavioral pre-assessments typically address physical skills or specific and observable skills, such as the performance of athlete proficiencies or playing a musical instrument. These assessments can also gauge social emotional skills. So you might have your students do a quick pre-reflection on how well they work with others, if they prefer to work by themselves, in pairs, or in small groups, or perhaps with the teachers. You might ask them a question about their resiliency skills and what happens if they have a problem that they can't solve. Do they give up? Do they persevere? What strategies do they use? A phys ed teacher or a music teacher might also find themselves using a pre-assessment that measures skills and dispositions as well. So you might ask your learners to model a particular skill, like swinging a baseball bat or doing a push-up or playing an instrument before the actual lesson to gauge their level of proficiency before instruction. So take a moment just to think about, for which purpose do you find yourself most commonly using pre-assessments? To measure knowledge, skills, attitudes, or dispositions, or maybe a combination of all four. When designing a pre-assessment, it is important for teachers to be intentional about what it is that they're measuring. So if we go back to this definition, teachers need to think about ahead of time, what is it that I want to measure in my pre-assessment? Am I measuring knowledge, skills, attitudes, dispositions, or some combination? But it is also really important that teachers think about the purpose of the pre-assessment. Why am I using this assessment? What am I trying to gauge? According to Tom Guskey, there are three functions of a pre-assessment. The first is prerequisite, and that is designed to assess what students need to know in order and be able to do in order to access the new material. So perhaps in a math classroom, the learning is building on one another. You might need to measure what students mastered in the previous unit in order for them to apply it to any new learning. That would be an example of a prerequisite pre-assessment. There is also a present pre-assessment that assesses where students are right now in their learning. So this tells you exactly where they are in that present moment. And then finally, preview. And again, we sort of saw this at the beginning today when we did our Jamboard. In a preview pre-assessment, it assesses the knowledge, skills, and dispositions that comprise the learning targets of an upcoming lesson or unit. So maybe I want to do some activating some prior knowledge, or I want to see, are there any misconceptions around the topics that we're going to be talking about in our upcoming unit? That might be a preview pre-assessment. And although the learning goals measured by each of these forms of pre-assessment are distinct, their purpose sometimes overlaps. So you might find that when you're designing a pre-assessment, you might be measuring all three of these. So for example, a teacher may include several items that measure specific prerequisite knowledge and skills. In introducing a science unit on planetary motion, a teacher may ask students what they know about the planets in our solar system and also address the concepts of rotation and revolution. There are several guidelines for effective pre-assessment because there is nothing worse than starting off with students in a high stress, high stakes kind of environment. So I think it's really important upfront to clarify the purpose of the pre-assessment with the learners. Without a defined purpose or need for assessments, it's difficult to justify its existence. When assessment reflects and measures the intended learning goals, purpose is achieved. So it's really important that for our students, we're telling them up front, this is for us to gauge as teachers where you are in the learning process, what skills you've already mastered, and where we might need to go back and do some reteaching, or conversely, where we might be able to move you ahead and do some enrichment or curriculum compacting. It's also useful for the learner. When we think about developing personalized learning environments, one of the key components is empowering learners to make decisions based on their educational needs. And so when we use pre-assessments with learners, they're able to also reflect on what it is and advocate for what it is that they need in order to be successful. The second guideline is to determine how the information will be used. It's really important that teachers are intentional about using the information that they gather from the pre-assessment. Otherwise, it winds up being not a great use of instructional time. So teachers need to know ahead of time, am I going to use this information to group my learners? Am I going to use this information to determine what from a previous unit I need to reteach? Am I going to use this to maybe compact my curriculum? If I know that all of my learners are demonstrating a proficiency in this area, I might then be able to skip over that and go into some deeper, more complex learning. So from the start, teachers need to identify how they're going to use that information. And then finally, we have to use pre-assessments judiciously and efficiently. We want to be really thoughtful and mindful to not use a pre-assessment before every lesson and be intentional in our unit design of when pre-assessments make the most sense. Perhaps it's just at the beginning of a unit. Perhaps it's one or two or maybe three times throughout a unit as we start to introduce more complex topics. But we want to make sure that we are optimizing our instruction and not taking away from that instructional time. So again, this comes down to just being intentional with how and why we're using and when we're going to be using our pre-assessments. So to wrap up our discussion on the why of pre-assessments, I want to turn to this list of benefits of well-crafted pre-assessments. So what we can see here is that pre-assessments help teachers determine learners' prior knowledge and skills. And I would argue too that it also allows learners to determine their prior knowledge and skills if we're intentional about building in that time for reflection and empowering learners to use their assessment data to make informed decisions and to advocate for what they need. It's a great way to monitor student progress. It also communicates expectations. When we think about just that simple pre-assessment we did at the beginning of our session today, it was kind of laying out that good teaching incorporates pre-assessments and that pre-assessments can be a powerful tool or strategy in accelerated learning. It also focuses learners' attentions on the learning targets, as we saw that kind of activated our prior knowledge and got us in that headspace of being ready and willing to talk about pre-assessments. It checks for preconceptions. So it gives me a really good idea if a students have a misunderstanding around a particular idea, I can address that before we get started. That way we have that solid foundation. And then finally, it helps us to get to know our learners a little bit better, especially if we're asking those questions around their attitudes and dispositions. So it gives us some insights into their interests, their talents, their preferred ways of learning. I love this quote from Tom Guskey. Careful consideration of the purpose, form, and content of pre-assessments can guide teachers in taking advantage of the potential benefits of prerequisite, present, and preview pre-assessments while avoiding their potential drawbacks. Although not necessary in advance of every lesson, the occasional and purposeful use of well-crafted pre-assessments can be a helpful tool for teachers in their efforts to have all students learn well. So I think, again, it's really important as teachers that we sit down and identify why we're using this pre-assessment, when we're going to use that pre-assessment, and how we're going to use that data. It's also really important that we communicate that to our learners as to not create any unnecessary stress or anxiety about the new learning that's about to take place. So let's talk a little bit, and I'll have you do a quick reflection. How can pre-assessments accelerate learning? So what do you see as the connection between strong pre-assessments and accelerated learning? Feel free to pause the video if you want to do some journaling or some jotting, or if you just want to have some think time around that. But when we think about pre-assessments, they help teachers to make better decisions on where and how to accelerate learning. So when we get that pre-assessment data, we're able then to group our learners to say, okay, this group of particular learners may need additional instruction to fill in those gaps so that they are ready and able to access that grade level material. We might find a group of learners who are ready to go and who are ready to access that grade level material. And conversely, we may have a group of learners who might be beyond that grade level material and are ready for some enrichment. So using carefully crafted intentional pre-assessments helps us to better accelerate learning, to help close any gaps that may have happened because of the pandemic, or even beyond our pandemic times. You know, we know that this idea of learning lag and gaps in learning is nothing new. And so even as we move beyond the pandemic, pre-assessments can be a powerful strategy in helping teachers make sure that learners are ready and able to access that important, complex grade level material. So let's just quickly spend some time looking at some fantastic resources to help support the development of strong pre-assessments. I reflect on my time as a high school social studies teacher, and I would design pre-assessments because I knew they were good practice. But I have to admit, I don't know that I was always as intentional. I was thoughtful. I used the data, but I don't know that I necessarily thought through specific points when designing pre-assessments. ASCD has put together a fantastic blueprint to help guide teachers in designing intentional and purposeful pre-assessments. And this link can be found in that resource link that I provided at the beginning of this webinar. So just a quick overview of the blueprint. They provide an exemplar to take a look at. And then they also provide a blank. So we see the domains for pre-assessment here. So are we measuring prior school experiences? Are we measuring their vocabulary knowledge, their concept knowledge, their attitudes, any personal connections they may have? And then there's a space for teachers to generate planned questions and then even take notes on what they observe after delivering the pre-assessment. It's also important to note that that learning target is listed here at the top, and this helps teachers become crystal clear on what it is that they hope to measure in that pre-assessment. So I really love this blueprint tool as just some guardrails for creating really intentional and purposeful pre-assessments. The last thing I want to leave you with are 10 really fantastic pre-assessment strategies. And what I love about these strategies is that they can be used traditional pen and paper or whiteboard and marker, or teachers could very easily put these into a technology tool to gain data more efficiently and perhaps build in some more engagement. So we see things like oral questioning, having conversations with learners, listening and taking notes. Brainstorming sessions, asking students to organize their thoughts around a particular question or topic. So students could do this on sticky notes. They might do it in a Jamboard where they're populating digital sticky notes. They could be brainstorming on a whiteboard or even on a tool like Padlet where they're populating their responses on a digital corkboard essentially. We can also do some small group talk where you're getting students to collaborate and communicate with their peers. So you could put students in heterogeneous groups of 2 to 4 students, give them some questions to talk about, and then as a teacher, you observe as students are working in small groups. I won't go through all of these. These are just some of my favorite, really simple, quick, and powerful pre-assessment tools. And again, this link can be found in that general link that was shared at the beginning of today's session. I hope this was helpful in getting you started in your pre-assessment journey, or at least to spark some prior knowledge and serve as a reminder for how to use really powerful pre-assessment strategies to accelerate learning. For more information on IU13's Accelerated Learning Series and resources, please check out the link on the screen. I want to thank you for taking some time to be here today to listen to some ideas on ways to more intentionally accelerate our learning in the classroom for our students as we recover from the pandemic. These are some additional resources that you may want to check out from Pennsylvania Department of Education. These are links to all of their learning, accelerated learning resources, and can also be found on our IU13 Accelerated Learning website. Again, if at any point you have any questions about this session or need additional accelerated learning supports, please don't hesitate to reach out and contact me via email at tony_martindale@iu13.org. I again want to thank you for being here today, and I look forward to collaborating with you in the future.